my pleasure to be here today to present our recommendations for the upcoming 2018-2019 deer season. I do want to note that these regulations were developed with significant input from all members of our CWD program, which includes Aaron Hildreth, Kevin Wiskirkin, and Jasmine Batten. So today I'm going to begin with an update on our 2017-2018 deer season harvest and an update on how our population is doing in the state. Then I will give an update on our 2017-2018 CWD surveillance and management efforts, and then present our regulation recommendations for this upcoming 2018-2019 deer season. As a reminder, relatively minor changes were made for regulations going into the 2017 deer season. They were mostly related to the new additions of counties into our CWD management zone. And as reference, here are our 2016 deer harvest totals for each portion of the deer season. As a reminder, deer harvest during 2016 was down slightly from the previous year. And here we can see the 2017 deer harvest totals. Those numbers in the brackets next to the harvest totals represent the percent change from the previous year. So you can see that for the most part, deer harvest was up in 2017 compared to the previous year. Notably, we had a very good early youth season harvest, up 56% compared to the previous year. This was particularly favorable weather that weekend, which likely contributed to that high harvest. Our late youth and archery season harvests were actually record harvests. These are the highest harvests that we ever recorded for those portions. The only portion in which we had a decrease from the previous year was our alternative methods portion, which was 6% less than the previous year. This may be related to some pretty difficult weather during alternative methods portion. It was very cold during that portion. And given the high success rate that we had during the November portion, hunters may have been a little less motivated to be out in the woods during that time. Overall, our total firearms and our total deer harvest was up 7% compared to the previous year. It was also up 7% compared to our 10-year mean. So again, this was a good harvest this past year. It was the 9th ranked total harvest compared to all of the harvest seasons that we've had in Missouri. So this is likely related to population recovery throughout much of our state from our 2012 severe hemorrhagic disease outbreak, which did cause deer population declines throughout much of the state. So we do believe our populations are well on the way to the recovery throughout most of our state. This figure shows our harvest success for firearms harvest, which is those orange bars, and then archery harvest in the green bars. This past year, our firearms success rate was right at 40%, pretty similar to where it's been in the past, but a slight increase from last year. Our archery season harvest was down slightly at about 16.9%. However, I do not think that this really accurately reflects what archery success rates were. I'll explain that a little bit later, but we do have reason to believe that there were a lot of people who obtained archery permits, particularly landowners, that actually had no intention of archery hunting. And I'll explain that a little bit later. As I mentioned, we did have a record archery season harvest this year, so that was 51,991. 9% higher than the previous year. It was 5% higher than our 5-year average and 10% higher than our 10-year average. As a reminder, in 2016, we did make a pretty significant regulation change where we allowed crossbows as a legal method during archery season. And we do record or monitor the effect of crossbows on our archery season harvest during the telecheck process, where we do ask archery hunters, successful archery hunters, if they used a crossbow when they're checking their deer. In the first year, in 2016, we saw that 30% of our archery season harvest could be attributed to crossbows, and we did see an increase in that this year to 38%, and that also accounted for 7% of our total deer harvest. This is pretty similar to what other states see. They generally do see an increase in the crossbow component of their archery harvest as the years go on and crossbows are allowed. So we can expect that that will continue to increase next year. I do want to note that although we did have a record archery season harvest and we had an increase in the crossbow component of that harvest, the proportion of our total or overall deer harvest that is composed of archery or deer that are harvested during archery season has not really changed. It still represents about 18% of our total or overall harvest, and that's what it represented prior to the crossbow allowance. This figure shows the sex and age composition of our harvest over time since 1997. The green bar or the green line represents our doe harvest, the blue line represents antlered buck harvest, and the red line represents button buck harvest. So you can see that beginning in 2014, we began harvesting more antlered bucks than does, and that's the first time that that happened in the prior 10 years. And that was an intention of some of the regulation changes that we made to reduce some of the pressure on the doe segment of our population and to allow populations to recover from that severe hemorrhagic disease outbreak. And that has continued, that trend has continued since that time. And for the past 2 years, we've actually had record antlered buck harvest in the state. So for the second year, we've harvested more antlered bucks than we ever have in the state. And so that this year, that number was 136,127. I'll explain a couple of factors which are contributing to that record antlered buck harvest. This map represents the change in antlered buck harvest by county. This is the percent change relative to the previous year. So those counties that are in red and orange represent decreases in antlered buck harvest compared to the previous year. Those counties that are from yellow to green represent increases in antlered buck harvest. So for the most part, you can see throughout much of the state, we did have increases in antlered buck harvest, and that was pretty well distributed throughout much of the state. We did have a total of about 8,000 more antlered bucks harvested in 2017 compared to 2016, and that was distributed across 80% of the counties. I do want to note that those counties which saw some of the highest increases in antlered buck harvest were those counties where we rescinded the antler point restriction last year. And this is similar to what we saw in 2016. The counties with the highest antlered buck harvest were those where we rescinded the antler point restriction. And so those 4 counties where we rescinded the antler point restriction are represented with those yellow stars there, and that's in the St. Clair area. Those 4 counties alone accounted for 16% of that increase in antlered buck harvest. Another factor which might be contributing to that increase in antlered buck harvest is that our hunters might be becoming slightly more selective in the deer that they choose to harvest. So during our hunter opinion surveys, which we conduct every few years, we do ask hunters what their plans are for harvesting deer, whether they intend to harvest the first legal deer that comes along, or whether they're planning to harvest mostly large antlered bucks. And so we have seen since the 1990s, the percent of hunters which choose to harvest their first legal deer has been decreasing. So again, that might influence that higher antlered buck harvest that we're seeing, is that hunters might be becoming more selective in the deer they choose to take. So we believe, again, the removal of the antler point restriction in some of those counties, overall harvest increases that we're seeing throughout the state, which is related to that recovery of our deer population throughout the state, slight increase in hunter selectivity, as well as the continued favorable timing of our opening weekend and of the November portion are likely contributing to this high antlered buck harvest. Specifically, our opening day for the November portion generally creeps 1 day earlier each year with the calendar creep. That's going to continue for this year. So this upcoming season in 2018, opening weekend will occur the earliest date in the calendar that it can with our current season timing. And then that will reset itself, which it does about every 6 years. So in 2019, that date will move back further into the calendar. We can expect to see decreases in antlered buck harvest due to that. And this is just due to the timing and overlap with that opening day and the timing of the deer rut. Antlered bucks are certainly more susceptible and vulnerable to harvest if they coincide with the height of the deer rut. So again, we can expect that trend to continue, all other factors held constant for 2018. This figure represents our hunter participation over the past few years. The green line here represents total numbers of hunters with holding permits, and the blue line represents those firearms hunters. The red line represents our archery hunters. So you can see that for the most part, our total number of hunters has remained relatively stable over the past few years. There is a very slight decline there, but for the most part, this is pretty stable. The firearms trends follow very closely to what those total trends are. However, if you look at the red line there representing our archery permit holders, you can see that since 2016, that has increased. The first year that it increased in 2016 is likely due to the allowance of crossbows as a method of archery harvest and recruiting more hunters due to that allowance. In 2017, I believe that number of 240,529 is a bit inflated. And that is because there was a change this year in 2017 made to the way that landowners were able to obtain their permits. So in the past, when a landowner went into a vendor to obtain their no-cost permits, the vendor would have to enter information specific to each permit that landowner wanted to obtain and to print out in those individual permits separately. A change was made in 2017 where the vendor only needed to enter that information once, and then they could simply print off all of the permits that landowner could legally obtain. So what we think happened is a lot of landowners ended up walking out of vendors with archery permits that actually had no intention of archery deer hunting. And we can see that reflected in the percent increases in permits by type that were issued in 2017 compared to 2016. So here we have the mean number of permits issued by type from 2011 to 2015 as reference. You can see that in 2016 there was an increase in archery permits, likely due to that crossbow allowance. In 2017, we saw even higher increases specifically in those landowner archery permits. So you can see a 53% increase in the landowner archery permits and a 67% increase in landowner archery antlerless permits. So again, we believe that this might not really be that representative of actual archery hunters. And we hope to correct these numbers. As you probably know, we do conduct our archery deer hunting surveys each year. And so a random selection of people that obtained archery deer permits will be sent surveys, and hopefully we can, based on the number of people who actually said they participated in archery deer season and the number of deer that they harvested, we can correct those participation and success numbers using that data. So as a summary, our harvest this year reflects likely deer population recovery across most of the state, favorable timing and weather of our November portion, and some of those regulation changes that we put into effect. Our hunter participation seems to be stable to slightly decreasing. This is similar to what many other states are seeing. Actually, some other states are seeing some more starker declines in hunter participation due to an aging population. And it really speaks to the importance of our hunter retention and recruitment efforts to keep those or continue to keep those hunters engaged in the sport. So with that, I'll move on to my next section, which is an update on chronic wasting disease surveillance in the state. So our 2017-2018 CWD sampling season will conclude on July 1st, but for the most part, the bulk of samples for this year have been collected and tested. And so we have collected to date just under 25,000 total CWD samples this year. That's distributed mostly within our management zone surveillance. So 21,779 samples were collected in our CWD management zone. And then our statewide surveillance, where we work with cooperating taxidermists to collect samples for us, was 2,708 samples collected as part of that effort. I do want to point out that targeted culling is part of our management zone surveillance, but it's very important to pull those samples out and discuss those separately. So we collected almost 1,500 samples as a part of our targeted culling efforts. To date, we have detected a total of 33 CWD positive deer in the state this year. 16 of those were hunter harvested, 15 being a part of our management zone surveillance, and then one coming from that statewide surveillance that we conduct with cooperating taxidermists. We had our first roadkill positive deer this year, and that was in the St. Clair area. And then 16 positives came as part of that targeted culling effort. And I do want to highlight that although the targeted culling samples represent about 6% of overall the samples that we collect, they account for nearly 50% of the positive deer that we detect. And so those are 16 positive deer that would have remained on the landscape had we not conducted those winter operations and targeted culling. So it's pretty important for our ability to manage the disease in the state. That brings our cumulative total to 75 since we began testing for CWD in the state. I want to just briefly show you the geographic distribution of those 33 positive deer and where we found them. 3 positive deer were detected in our Adair Corps area. 4 positive deer were detected in the Northern Lynn, Sullivan County Corps area. This is a new Corps area which was just created this year due to the detection of 1 positive deer, so we detected an additional 3 after that first detection. 6 positive deer in our Macon Lynn Corps area. 8 positive deer in our St. Clair Cedar Polk Corps area. 4 positive deer in our southwest Franklin core area, 1 positive deer in the southern Jefferson St. Genevieve core area, 6 positive deer in the St. Genevieve core area. This was another new core area that was created this year. And then 1 positive deer in Perry County, and this was that statewide surveillance deer that we detected with the help of a taxidermist. Now there are some more uplifting results that we want to highlight. So there are some areas where we failed to detect positive deer this year. That includes the southern Lynn core area. This is an area we've only detected 1 positive deer to date. So we tested 64 deer there this year and failed to detect any additional positive deer. Our Cole Montauk surveillance zone, we tested 226 deer here and failed to detect any positives. Our northern Franklin County core area, we tested 111 deer here and failed to detect any positives. And then along our southern border counties with Arkansas, we've tested almost 2,500 deer there. As you are well aware, Arkansas has the disease just across our border at a relatively high prevalence rate, and it's positive that we have not detected any positive deer along our border with Arkansas. I do want to point out some important notes about CWD in our neighboring states. Iowa detected a positive deer in the southern portion of their state this year. That was in Wayne County, so that borders the northern border with Missouri. That was a hunter-harvested deer in close proximity to our northern Missouri border, and this does affect some of the recommendations I'll be putting forward for some of our northern Missouri counties this year. Arkansas, as you are well aware, have CWD at a relatively high prevalence rate. This year they tested about 5,400 deer. They detected 138 new positives this year alone. 131 of those white-tailed deer and 7 elk. Do want to note that they did detect a positive deer in Benton County, which shares our border with McDonald County in the extreme southwest portion of our state. And again, that will affect some of the recommendations that I'll be bringing forward for that area. So to summarize CWD surveillance and management in the state, it's important to note that CWD is still a very rare disease in our state. Although the geographic spread of the disease can seem disappointing, it's important to note that where we have found it, it seems to be a relatively new infection, so it's been at a low prevalence where we've detected it in the state. Another positive aspect is that we continue to maintain a low prevalence in those areas where we've had the disease the longest. So in the Macon, Lynn, and Adair core area, through the management that we're able to keep it at a relatively low prevalence. And with that, I'll move into what the recommendations are this year for regulation changes. Our first recommendation is to allow unlimited archery antlerless permits in Butler, Iron, and Reynolds counties. This is in the southeast portion of our state. This map here represents what the current distribution of archery antlerless permits are. As a reminder, the only option is unlimited for archery antlerless permits. We don't have any other allowances less than that at this point. And so you can see that for the most part, the entire state has unlimited archery antlerless permits available, with the exception of a few counties in the southeast portion of our state. The current regulations for these 3 counties are to allow 1 resident landowner firearms antlerless permit, 0 firearms antlerless permits to permittees, and it is closed due to the antlerless portion of our firearms season. Obviously, currently, we don't allow any archery antlerless permits there. This figure represents the harvest trends in these 3 counties. You can see that it has been increasing over time, and we believe this reflects a growing or slowly growing deer population in these 3 counties. So again, allowing unlimited archery antlerless permits in these 3 counties, we believe, is a conservative approach to begin to liberalize harvest here. We have in the past made the change to allow unlimited archery antlerless permits to other counties in the southeast, notably Madison and Wayne counties in 2011 and Stoddard County in 2014. So we looked at what happened with regards to harvest in these counties after we made that change to kind of assess how the change would affect the deer population in these 3 counties. And for the most part, we think that it will minimally impact the deer population. It may increase the percent of the doe population that will be harvested to between 7 and 17% of the doe population. And so that, we believe, will not cause population declines at this time. The second recommendation is to include Howell County in the antlerless portion of the firearms season. So here you see Howell County at the southern border with Arkansas. The current regulations here are to allow 2 resident landowner firearms antlerless permits, 2 firearms antlerless permits to permittees, unlimited archery antlerless permits, and then obviously it's currently closed to the antlerless portion of our firearms season. The harvest in Howell County, which is reflected here in this graph, has been increasing over recent years. This past year in 2016, we did have record harvest in Howell County, which again we believe is reflecting an increasing deer population in this county. The antlerless portion, which again is a 3-day season, typically accounts for about 5 to 10% of total doe harvest in the county. Since we've reduced it to that 3 days, we don't believe that opening Howell County to the antlerless portion of the firearms season will significantly affect the deer population there. We are projecting that it will increase harvest from about 2,950 does harvested to between 3,000 and 3,200 does harvested, which again, we think maybe will increase the percent of the doe population that's being harvested from about 15% to between 18 and 19%. This will help stabilize or perhaps slow the growth of that deer population. We don't believe it will cause population declines. So again, we have a growing deer population in this county, allowing landowners the opportunity to harvest additional deer during the antlerless portion of the firearms season. Again, will provide them the additional opportunity to manage the deer population. It's not likely to significantly impact the deer herd here. It's also important to note that Howell County is along our border with Arkansas, and although it is not currently in a CWD management zone, it is on the border with other counties in the CWD management zone. So it seems appropriate to begin to stabilize the population here. Our third recommendation is to remove Andrew, Atchison, Holt, and Nottoway counties from the antlerless portion of the firearms season. These counties are in the extreme northwest portion of our state, as you see here. Current regulations for these counties are to allow 2 resident landowner firearms antlerless permits, 1 firearms antlerless permits to permittees, unlimited archery antlerless permits, and obviously they are open currently to the antlerless portion of our firearms season. So this portion of our state has had population declines. It was most severely impacted by the 2012 hemorrhagic disease outbreak, while other areas of our state seem to have recovered or seem to be on the road to recovery from that outbreak. These northwest counties are one area of the state which seems to lag behind and seems to be struggling to recover from that. And so this figure here represents the harvest trend in those 4 counties. You can see that they've decreased significantly from the 2000s and have failed to recover. The harvest in these counties is 23 to 37% below the 10-year mean. We are seeing an increasing percentage of firearms hunters that think there are too few deer, and an increasing percent of landowners that think there are too few deer in these counties. So we believe the deer population here is well below socially acceptable levels. So it seems like a prudent and conservative measure to remove this additional harvest opportunity, which is no longer needed here. Our fourth recommendation is with regards to adding new counties to the CWD management zone. So the regulations that typically go along with that is to remove the antler point restriction where it exists, increase the availability of antlerless permits, and expand the antlerless portion to cover those new counties. This map here shows in orange our current CWD management zone counties, and then a 25-mile buffer around our positive CWD sections, and then the proposed new additions to the CWD management zone are in that cream color there. So you can see that these counties all fall within that 25-mile buffer of new detections on the landscape. So with these proposed additions, we would be moving towards 48 total counties in a CWD management zone. And those 7 counties include Bollinger, Cape Girardeau, Grundy, Madison, McDonald, Mercer, and Perry counties. As a reminder, a regulation that goes into effect when a county is placed into a CWD management zone is that a feeding and supplemental mineral ban will go into effect with that. So removing the antler point restriction will only affect 2 counties where it currently exists in the state, and that's Mercer and Grundy counties in the northern portion of our state. Removing those 2 counties from the antler point restriction will reduce the number of counties that are currently under an antler point restriction to 37 total counties. Firearms antlerless permits increases include increasing the antlerless permits to 2 in Grunder, Mercy, McDonald, and Perry counties. That's the approach that we typically take. We are this year advocating for a slightly more conservative approach to some of those counties in the southeast. And so that includes Ballinger and Cape Girardeau counties, which are currently at 1 firearms antlerless permit. We're recommending that we maintain those at 1 firearms antlerless permit. We only added Ballinger, 1 antlerless permit to Ballinger last year. We do believe that the current harvest in those counties is likely enough to maintain a stable population, and that is the objective of increasing firearms antlerless permits to 2, is not to decrease countywide deer populations, but rather maintain stable populations and prevent population increases. And we believe that we can achieve that with maintaining 1 in Ballinger and Cape Girardeau County. Madison County previously had 0 firearms antlerless permits, so we think it's reasonable to increase it from 0 to 1 firearms antlerless permits rather than 0 to 2. Obviously, we'll monitor how these changes affect harvest in these 3 counties and the deer populations, and assess whether we need to make any changes in the next year. However, as far as landowner antlerless permits are concerned, we are increasing those, or recommending that we increase those to 2 to all new additions to our CWD management zone. So we would increase landowner antlerless permits to 2 in Ballinger, Cape Girardeau, Madison, McDonald, and Perry counties. We are also recommending that we open the antlerless portions to all new additions to CWD management zone. And so that includes Ballinger, Cape Girardeau, Howell, Madison, McDonald, and Perry counties. As a reminder, this map represents what that will look like in the booklet for those counties that are open during the antlerless portion. And so I just do want to point out that that also reflects taking those 4 counties in the northwest portion out and adding Howell County to the antlerless portion. Our 5th recommendation is this is with regards to mandatory sampling during the CWD, in the CWD management zone. And so we do recommend that we require mandatory sampling during the opening weekend of firearm season in 31 counties in our CWD management zone. As a reminder, the objectives of our mandatory sampling regulation are to assess and establish a baseline for disease occurrence, intensity, and spatial distribution in new areas of detection, monitor changes in disease patterns, and detect sparks from CWD core areas. I just do want to point out that monitoring the disease in this way does require many more samples than simply with our statewide surveillance effort, and where we simply want to detect the disease where it exists on the landscape. And so these are those counties in gray shown on this map are those that we are recommending have mandatory sampling. And so I won't read through that laundry list of counties, but I will note that these counties represent new additions to our CWD management zones, counties where a CWD positive deer have been detected, and those counties within approximately 5 miles of where a CWD positive deer has been detected, as well as those counties along the border of Arkansas, given the high prevalence just across our border. Kevin Wiskirkin is the IC this year for mandatory sampling. He provided me with this map. So they've already been trying to identify where we might do the sampling in these counties. And so the sampling locations are represented here with those blue triangles, and then a 15-mile buffer around those locations you can see here. So that covers most of the counties where we're asking to conduct mandatory sampling. Always important to consider the demand on staff with regards to this sampling. So we estimate that we might require about 814 total staff to sample at these 61 stations that we're proposing. So as a reminder, in 2017, we used 830 staff to sample in 25 counties. In 2016, we used over 1,000 staff to sample in 29 counties. So we are improving our efficiency at these sampling stations, and that's through the help of Kevin Wiskirkin and Danny Hartwig have put a lot of thought into how we can become more efficient. And so we do think that we can reduce the number of staff needed per station by about 10% and still achieve good hunter success rate or good customer service with our hunters. And our 6th recommendation is with regards to our CWD management seals that we issue, we recommend to continuing to offer those to landowners in our CWD core areas. And so those number of core areas has increased this year, and so it includes the Adair, Macon Lynn, North Franklin, and Jefferson, Lynn Sullivan, St. Clair, Southwest Franklin, and St. Genevieve core areas. So we have increased the number of those core areas where we plan to issue these seals. As a reminder, last year we issued seal packets to 180 total landowners, and that was just in 3 core areas that we had at that time. 143 deer were harvested on those seals, and we did detect 1 positive deer as a result of those seals. Our final recommendations are the approval of conservation regulation amendments for the upcoming year and the approval of our managed deer hunt regulations for the upcoming year. And this slide simply summarizes all those recommendations I've presented, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Man, you've done some preparing for that presentation. Fantastic. Questions, Commissioner Murphy?
I think you answered it later in your presentation, but it occurred to me as I listened to your comment that the percent of archery harvested deer had not changed with the allowance of crossbows.
Correct.
But the number of archers participating, which is something we were really trying to get at with the regulation, that appears to have worked. It appears to
Correct.
have increased. What approximately is the percentage of that increase?
The percent of archery hunters, well, I will say that we've had an increase in new recruits by about 30% in 2016 over the past few years.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
And we are seeing higher increases in hunters buying permits in our older age classes and our younger age classes. And we also see that with the successful crossbow hunters. We tend to have more successful crossbow hunters in the younger and older age classes.
Just so that I reinforce my understanding of this, we've increased the participation.
Correct.
And we have not increased the risk to the resource.
Correct. I believe so.
Very
Mr.
thorough.
Bradford.
I appreciate it, Barbara. Clearly, you guys have stayed on top of the CWD management and appreciate that close eye on that. It's such a concern for our state. So managing between the ditches here, but appreciate all the effort because you clearly have collected the data and tried to do what we can do to manage it. So good job on that. Thank you.
Barbara, I wish that most of the people that hunt in our state could have heard the presentation that you just presented, because so many people think that when the commission sets dates and we do things, that we just do it from the hip, just do a hip shot. They have no idea of the kind of research that is conducted and thought process. Out of curiosity, with the deer kill that we've experienced here, how does that compare to surrounding states like Arkansas, Kentucky, or would you have that information?
Yes, so generally we're higher than Arkansas. There are some states that we have lower deer harvest. Michigan and Wisconsin are much higher than we are. They also have more hunters than we do. But we're among the top in the Midwest area, but not the highest.
Okay, well, we appreciate the presentation and appreciate all the hard work that you and the staff have done. Any other questions, comments?
Just one. In the survey where it asks if you shot the first legal deer, and then the alternative was large antler bucks, there's a few eccentrics like me that selectively harvest does.
Right. We ask actually a series of options, and then we compile options into selective hunters versus non-selective hunters at the end.
And I'm aware of that. I appreciate that. I want to make sure that others knew that you did that.
Okay,
Thank you.
It will be interesting to note, commissioners, as we advance the Archery in the Schools program to the extent that we have and we are, to see the changes in the permits and be interested in following that. But anyway, thank you, Barbara.